relative newcomer here in New Zealand, and having arrived in 2013, before my furniture had actually shown up, and my only surface at home consisted of a closet door laid on top of 2 cardboard boxes, I had the pleasure of experiencing my first New Zealand earthquake. And since then, I've been increasingly aware of the reality of living on a fault line. And sometimes our house shakes from the wind, and sometimes it's just the ground moving. And somehow this phenomenon has become an accepted part of our daily lives here in Wellington. And since we're in Wellington, I'll contextualize this a little bit by speaking about Wellington earthquakes. As you walk through Wellington, you might come across these plaques marking the original shoreline of Wellington Harbor. Now, the plaques are primarily a reference to the land reclamation that started in the 1850s, but what they remind me of is the magnitude 8.2 Wairapa earthquake that occurred in 1855 that changed the shoreline quite drastically by bumping it up in height about 1.5 meters. And as we all know, earthquakes come with the threat of tsunamis. And if you live along the coastal shores around Wellington, the tsunami lines painted on the road are an ever-present reminder of this very real threat. And earthquakes are such a dominant presence in our lives here in Wellington that not only are CERA, that's C-E-R-A, and the Earthquake Commission, I want to say, getting in on the action, but our local roller derby team has capitalized on our shaky predicament. And lest you forget that you live in a hotspot for seismic activity, the Wellington City Council has posted lots of signs to warn the community about the potential hazards associated with our earthquake-prone disposition. And these serve as constant reminders, and while perhaps these warnings are reassuring on some level, I think ultimately they fuel our collective anxiety about the risk of a potentially cataclysmic natural disaster in our daily lives. I was not yet living in New Zealand when the Christchurch earthquakes occurred, but I have observed the emotional impact that these earthquakes have had on the collective psyche of New Zealand. And having witnessed the haunting remnants of the mostly abandoned city has certainly left an impact on me and my perceptions of home as a symbol of stability. So, as a furniture designer, I found it interesting that a simple table has the capacity to take on a completely transformative role during earthquakes, changing from a work surface to a shelter. And of course, my own earthquake-related stress levels were only invigorated by what I have learned to understand as the common occurrence of solid earth moving from beneath my feet. And I started to look at furniture around me in a whole new way. And I became painfully aware that all of that hollow core, veneer, Scandinavian-inspired IKEA furniture that I just shipped into New Zealand was a fairly pathetic excuse for a shelter, and not a significant improvement on my closet door propped up on cardboard boxes. At Victoria University, where I teach, my fears were only amplified when my colleagues and I were each distributed with a cardboard box labeled emergency kit. Thank you, Margaret. And told to stock this box full of enough food rations and supplies to keep us alive for 3 or more days while we lived beneath our office desks, apparently gorging on sweets and muesli bars. In contemplating the characteristics that comprise New Zealand's design DNA, the notion of Kiwi ingenuity and the number 8 wire mentality often comes to the forefront, and I think we've heard a number of people bring this up today. In line with a number of our previous presenters, I would like to propose that at the heart of these characteristics is a distinct quality of creative resilience. New Zealanders are adept at making things work under challenging circumstances. As I can attest from observing my students, New Zealand designers are exceptionally skilled at making it work. producing innovative outcomes on a budget with minimal materials, in a southerly gale force wind, and at the 11th hour. Gideon, I'm looking at you. Our designers are inclined to bounce back from adversity, all the while maintaining a sense of humor and an unwavering, easy-as attitude. And I think that this resilience is partially the result of living on unstable ground, where one's emotional health and survival requires the ability to respond to adversity while maintaining our sense of humor and a positive outlook. So I've been exploring this idea, the marriage between earthquakes, design, and furniture, and resilience in my own work through the design and production of speculative furniture. And I thought that by sharing a few of these designs may be useful in pinpointing what I mean by resilience. These rocking earthquake benches that you see here are conceived as public seating, each with a regionally contextual map that indicates major seismic events that have occurred across New Zealand. The aim of the benches is to acknowledge the impact of our seismic geographic disposition on the collective national identity of New Zealand, and to mitigate the negative associations with earthquakes through the playful interaction. And it is through this playful interaction that our history of seismic events is perhaps reinterpreted and reassociated, thus promoting a psychological resilience. In conceiving of the seismic cabinet, I was given an opportunity through the Whole House Reuse project in Christchurch to transform the materials from a home demolished as a result of the Canterbury earthquakes. And the seismic cabinet aims to celebrate the enduring experience of earthquakes in New Zealand, and it achieves this through the perpetual act of mark making via the built-in seismometer, analog seismometer. As the door slides open, the action is recorded, providing a visual memory of the movement. The materials chosen for this cabinet are a reference to the New Zealand batch vernacular, an effective exemplification of good old Kiwi ingenuity. Again, through the day-to-day celebration of seismic activity, the hope is that a sense of resilience is fostered. And the final project that I will share with you today is the Earthquake First Aid Kit. Following our last decent-sized earthquake, after those of us who were in the School of Architecture and Design buildings were evacuated, and then finally we were given the green light to go back in, I noticed strangely that all of my colleagues were nowhere to be found. When I asked them about this the next day, they all told me unanimously that they had headed to the pub next door, Havana. A speculative design project, the Earthquake First Aid Kit raises awareness about the potential risk and increased instances of substance abuse that are frequently associated with earthquakes. It is a liquor cabinet that opens only in the event of a large seismic event, when the sensor triggers the release of the latch, meaning that the contents are only accessible at a dire time of need. Ultimately, it is the quirkiness of this object that cultivates resilience through the simple means of approaching adversity through humor. And while these examples are quite self-conscious regarding their relationship to seismic activity, the design investigation has raised a number of questions that I feel are relevant to the topic that we are discussing here at the Helix Symposium. How does the imminent threat of seismic activity impact or inform upon the New Zealand design identity? While I've presented and proposed this notion of resilience in the context of furniture, I think that it is equally applicable to all design disciplines, whether it's spatial, material, or media-based. Certainly, earthquakes have shaped New Zealand's national identity, so it seems within reason to consider how the imminent threat of earthquakes has perhaps also informed the New Zealand design identity. Does the New Zealand design identity reflect a particular attitude of resilience, inspired by living on continuously moving and shaking ground? Does New Zealand design embrace an aesthetic of temporality, dynamism, or ephemerality? Does it embrace an aesthetic of timelessness, stability, or permanence? Meaning, do we compensate for our lack of stability, or does our design reflect a unique proclivity and acceptance for change? Does New Zealand's precarious existence within the Pacific Ring of Fire fuel our innovation, risk-taking, and creativity? And if so, can we capitalize on this in order to bolster our New Zealand creative capital? Does New Zealand design reflect an identifiable note of humor or lightness? And this has come up before, this quirkiness, right? If so, might this reflect an effort to subconsciously or consciously promote psychological resilience? I wonder in what other ways might living on a fault line impact upon our design identity? And I welcome everyone's thoughts on this as we continue to hear all the presentations at Helix. Thank you so much.